I like to start out sort of big picture and then drill down in details. I'm often concerned and preoccupied with globalism and the American empire. I know you talk about the threat of globalism. It's almost as if the American empire is the battering ram for globalism. Today, it was reported that Alex and George Soros have maxed out their donations to Joe Biden for the next elections. I've read stories like the USAID financing drag queen events in Ecuador. Washington and Brussels seem to be pushing for one worldism everywhere. What are your thoughts on globalism today?
Thoughts on globalism? That's a loaded question. First, I think we do need to define it a little bit. The people that are today arguing for globalism were very similar to the people that wanted us to go to Vietnam. Walt Rostow and his brother were advocates for going into Southeast Asia with the goal of building a new nation on the foundations of South Vietnam. We've been going through this process off and on much longer than people realize. And what they were always interested in doing, and particularly today's group, is erasing national identities. They're convinced that the way to future utopia is to create a place where no one knows what or who they are, except, of course, the globalists at the top who know that they're in control and ruling the world. So that means you have to destroy national identities, destroy borders, effectively subvert populations from within by convincing the majority population in any country that there's something wrong with them, that they can only improve by abandoning control of their borders and inviting millions of people into their country who are radically different from them, to dilute their identity, change their identity, and ultimately erase any semblance of identity. I think that's a very important concept that most people in Europe don't understand. I don't think we in the United States get it. But if you look at the policies that we've been pursuing, it makes excellent sense, because the policies that we are pursuing are suicidal. They're designed to destroy us. Open your borders, vet no one, let everyone come in and disperse into your population. Then you create internal divisions and fights and wars and conflicts within conflicts, and you have chaos. Chaos then allows those with vast quantities of money like Soros, who are at the top of the pyramid, to exert absolute control, tell you how to live, what to believe, and so forth. And of course, a Trojan horse in the midst of all of this is atheism and nihilism and socialism. And we all know how socialism works. Anybody who lived in the so-called Eastern Bloc understands it. The state controls everything, which means a small minority governs, and everyone else is effectively reduced to some form of slavery. That's nothing that anybody with a brain wants, but that's where we are. And we have these people in Washington and London and Paris and Berlin, and they're driving this war. Now, why go to war with the Russians? Well, because the Russians sobered up, they abandoned communism. If Russia were a Soviet state, I'm sure that all of the globalists would be applauding, since they see that as yet another path to the utopia that they want to build. There used to be this thing we called the Soviet man. The Soviet man was this fictitious human being that would emerge over decades to replace all the various constituent peoples of the Soviet Union, and for that matter, Eastern Europe. And the joke, of course, in Moscow when the Soviet Union collapsed was, well, what happened to the Soviet man? Everybody looked around and, gosh, you know what they found? Ukrainians, Russians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Tartars, Turks, and so forth. So it's a tragic event, but right now, Russia is seen as a nationalist state with a strong cultural identity founded on Orthodox Christianity. Well, these things are all anathema to everybody in the globalist community. And to boot, they're sitting on top of some of the world's richest mineral resources, an abundance of agricultural development, foodstuffs. They stretch from one ocean to another. So if you can get into Russia, if you can subvert the government, you can destroy the government and replace it with one of your own choosing, which is effectively what we did in Ukraine. Well, then you have access to all of these resources. And I think the Russians understand this, and it's why they finally decided that this is indeed an existential fight that they have to win.
That I just mentioned, by the way, there was a popular tweet of yours that you put out recently, which said, quote, there are currently three branches of government, Raytheon, BlackRock, pharmaceutical companies follow the money. And maybe before delving deeper into Ukraine and Russia, to ask you about NATO, because I view that, I've come to view NATO as one of the key globalist institutions. I feel that it's openly not even a defensive organization, and it's like itching to become the UN army or one world army, if you will. Now they want to enter the Pacific. I guess they'll have to change their name to NAPTO or the GTO, the Global Treaty Organization. It seems like they're positioning to take the rest of the world. So what are your thoughts on NATO today?
Well, NATO was founded for one purpose, and when that purpose no longer existed, which was to defend the West against a potential Soviet attack, and the Soviet system collapsed along with the satellites that were part of it, people looked around and said, well, we no longer need NATO. In fact, I was one of them, and several of my colleagues said, well, this means we can go home. Fancy that. What an interesting notion. Americans will go home. And then we were told, oh, no, this is premature. NATO is such a successful alliance. It has a new purpose. And we all asked what that was. And the purpose was supposedly to prevent the outbreak of another war in Europe. Well, we thought that's reasonable, sounds plausible, and we went along with it. And then we discovered that had nothing to do with the new NATO. The new NATO was being militarized and instrumentalized to work as an appendage of globalist foreign policy run out of Washington and London. And that meant war on the Serbs in the Balkans. It was not a question of, are we intervening to bring peace? Are we looking for solutions that will work long term? No. The original intention was to go in and say everyone is going to be homogenized inside some amorphous state structure, which at the time, as you know, nobody wanted. It was called Yugoslavia. It was called the Soviet Union. Another one was Czechoslovakia. Everybody was anxious to get out from under these things so that they would have some degree of independence. Smaller republics responsive to the populations, and the populations wanted to be ruled by people like themselves, not foreigners. We reversed all of that, and we set about in the Balkans to create a new status quo, which hasn't held up very well because the underlying problems were never addressed. So that's effectively the problem with NATO now is that, well, we've been so successful in the Balkans and we're so successful in Ukraine that we want to extend this success to the Pacific. Why? Because we have another problem child called China. Thousands of years of civilization and identity in China are obviously a problem and need to somehow or another be subjugated. And we want as our allies the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, anybody we can find. It's a kind of insanity that makes absolutely no sense, but it fits with the globalist model. Keep trying to herd people in this particular direction until everyone is in your camp and you rule it. I don't see it happening, but I do wish they would change the name of NATO. It's not North. It's not even Atlantic anymore. I don't know what it is. I think they want it to be the Atlantic to the Urals alliance of nations devoted to globalism. That's going to be a hard sell with most Europeans and Americans and Canadians, but no, it's possible.
Yeah, I think we should put out a contest for best new name for NATO. And then getting back to Ukraine, we just had a second attack on the bridge in Crimea, and it seems, the Kremlin has been patient, but it seems like they're finally slowly putting their foot down. Apparently, they did not renew the grain deal. I've read that they have frozen assets of foreign companies like Dannon and Carlsberg. We had the Vilnius NATO summit, which apparently it appeared to make Zelensky and Kiev look weak. And I did just read before we connected, Biden administration announcing another 1.3 billion in weapons for Ukraine. Your thoughts on some of these developments and others. Where are we in the Ukraine war?
Well, it seems as though when you're on the brink of collapse and failure is standing in your face, the right course of action is to double down on the failed strategy that you've been pursuing. That seems to be the American way of doing business. The idea that you would step back and reassess, your position is simply foreign to people. This is one of my favorite stories is Hitler, who lands in Finland, and he had a conversation with Mannerheim, who was effectively the leading figure in Finland and the military commander. And in this conversation, which was recorded without the knowledge of its participants at the time, there were very frank discussions. And one of the statements that Hitler makes in his conversation is about overrunning parts of the Soviet Union, particularly a city, Kharkov, and talks about the factories that were there and the thousands of tanks that were produced, and how the slave labor at the factories lived like animals and so forth. And he said, who would have thought that anyone in their right mind would build 30 or 40,000 tanks in peacetime? If we had known this, we would never have invaded. Well, thank you. Well, why not then, now that you recognize that you've walked into this morass, why didn't he step back and say, this needs to end? This will take us nowhere. We can't maintain this indefinitely simply because of reasons of size, geography, demographics. Well, because that involves admitting that you were wrong. And no one in Washington wants to admit that they were wrong. And what were they wrong about? Well, they were wrong about Russia. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. They thought that Russia was still the backward, confused, chaotic state that it was in the 1990s. They missed entirely all of the things that had been done over the last 20 years by Vladimir Putin and his supporters. I'm not here to say that everything that they've done is perfect and has worked brilliantly, but it very definitely recovered Russia from the ash heap of history. And at the same time, we didn't understand that the Russians had maintained this large scientific industrial base to produce and manufacture military equipment. We didn't understand that the Russian population actually supports its government. We didn't understand any of these things. And so we embarked upon another regime change crusade in what we thought was another backward country that we could treat with complete contempt, the way we treated Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, go down the list. We found out that we were wrong. No one wants to step forward and say, hey, we were wrong. It's time for us to cut our losses, change horses, move on, whatever. On the contrary, we're doing what we did in Vietnam and everywhere else. We're sort of beating the nail into the ground with the same hammer over and over and over again. This is the sort of Einstein-like insanity that we've all heard about. That's what we have in Washington. And I think it's going to continue until we can't afford it. And then the real discussion is, well, when does this can't afford come about? Because we have all of these people who are confident that we can print money at will because we're the reserve currency and nothing can stop us. I'm one of those who thinks, like Nassim Taleb, that we are staring at Armageddon financially. And we are looking not just at Russia today, but a very close relationship between Moscow, Beijing, and Delhi. These three countries and the leaders in them know each other quite well. They've known each other for many, many years. It's a closer relationship than we in the West appreciate. And it's only a matter of time until the decision is made to fire sale our treasuries. And when that happens, our economy is in a lot of trouble, especially if the Fed tries to walk in and buy up all the bonds. That won't flush, literally, with the larger financial system in the world. So all of this has to be viewed as part of a huge problem that we have created for ourselves. And NATO is just part of it. It's not the only part, but NATO itself is crumbling. And this demonstration of solidarity in Vilnius that you saw is a facade. Behind that, people are horrified. The Germans are horrified because what was the original goal? Destroy Russia, regime change in Russia, create a new country. The Germans have already said, we don't want anything to do with that. They're smart enough to understand, as any European does, that when you destroy these nations, you have chaos. Chaos that results in wars, famine, conflict. Nobody wants it. But we're continuing to push it. And we're increasingly on our own. So when we put $1.6 billion down First of all, a lot of that cash will never leave the United States. It'll simply be laundered through the Pentagon, laundered through the so-called military-industrial complex. It will enrich lots of people invested in it, and particularly people in the Senate and the House. They will have lots of cash stuffed into their pockets for their trouble. Some of it will get to Ukraine, and we know from experience that a lot of it will just vanish into another black hole. We know that Zelensky and his crew all have nice fat bank accounts in places like Cyprus and elsewhere. Whenever they leave, and I think they will at some point, they'll go live in luxury, or so they think. But the country itself will be destroyed, and that's not their concern, because in the final analysis, Ukraine has never been meaningful to anybody in Washington or London. It's simply been a way to destroy Russia. Use Ukraine as cannon fodder. Use Ukraine's population, use its society, whatever is there to harm Russia. It's all backfiring, but there's nothing we can do about it at this point. But to expect anyone in Washington to suspend aid at this point is unrealistic. Now, will they at some point suspend aid? I suspect they'll have to. But right now, it's maintain appearances, keep them up, especially as you run up into the election next year. Because if everything changes between now and that election, and I think it probably will, then they have to explain away a huge strategic defeat, which is what Ukraine is going to represent to the United States and its allies.
Yeah, what you mentioned earlier, again, I read this morning that one of the Ukrainian heads of state, one of the daughters, their daughters purchased a home in the south of France to the tune of many, many millions. So just as you were saying, and maybe just a bit more on multipolarity. I've had a number of guests over the years, like Jim Rogers and Peter Schiff, talk about this coming crisis, de-dollarization, and the loss of the world reserve status. And I think it's coming in. Will that be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then this multipolar world that's coming into being? I mean, any further thoughts on what that will look like? They're talking about a common currency, and then what does America look like in a multipolar world?
I would go back to something called The Anarchical Society. It was a book written by Hedley Bull back in the late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in that time frame. And he predicts that the world will end up being regionalized. In other words, it's not a question of total chaos with every individual state going its own way. Rather, we'll see regions coalesce. We'll see new coalitions of people for various reasons. And right now, the one that's of greatest concern and strategic importance is, of course, the Eurasian coalition between China, Russia, and potentially even India, probably Iran. It's hard to tell at this point. But of course, then you have Central Asia, and both China and Russia have an interest in managing Central Asia. Central Asia is not entirely, but is largely Islamic. And the fear in Central Asia was harbored in both Moscow and Beijing was that the Islamic dimension would rage out of control and create the potential for conflict between them and between the various actors. The point is that we are now going to live in this regionalized world where different actors coalesce, work together. I can't give you an exact map at this point, but I think Hedley Bull was right. We can operate in that world very easily. We are North America. I mean, let's face it. I always laugh when people talk about the American Empire. Well, the American Empire to me was always North America. There was no need for anything else. And this, of course, was the argument that was made by the people that founded the country. They all anticipated that we would march all the way to the Atlantic, to the Pacific, that we would have an Atlantic to the Pacific country. It would end up with borders based on regional culture, history, language, religion. And indeed, that's what we have with the southern border. And the northern border just became a friendly border because, frankly, the people in Canada were viewed as essentially not very different from ourselves. And so we had the advantage of certainly peace in the north and a troublesome border in the south, but usually limited to criminality as opposed to anticipating large armies organizing to invade us. And the founders thought this is a wonderful thing for which we ought to strive, because once we've got that, we have all the resources we need. We have all the rivers that will help us with transportation and commerce. We'll have plenty of Europeans pile into the United States and populate these otherwise largely empty or desolate areas, and we'll become a very strong and successful society. No one anticipated that we would suddenly become interested in projecting our military power around the world. I mean, if you go back and look at Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, their view was that America should become the world's engine of prosperity. And their rationale was if it becomes the engine of prosperity, people everywhere will want to emulate us. They'll say, look, this is a successful business model, successful political model. Let's adopt something similar to it. The idea that we would go somewhere in the world and introduce our notions of how the world should be organized at gunpoint was something that no one at that time really anticipated. So that's where we are. And so whatever happens next, and I think what happens next is some kind of major financial crisis and economic turndown, the predisposition in this country will be to do what it has historically always done: bring home the troops. The first time we did not do that was after World War II. The reason for that was communism and the Cold War that followed. But once again, when that went away, the assumption of people like me in the American military was, well, great, let's go home. It didn't happen. So now I think we're going to be compelled, for reasons of finance and economics, to essentially say, that's it, bring the troops home. And they'll come home, and then we'll begin to do what we really need to do, which is turn inward and deal with the multitude of problems that we've created for ourselves here at home.
I sure hope so. And there's a question that I ask a number of my guests. We talked about globalism, Putin, Russia, the conservative Russia. I'm a conservative. I'm anti-globalist, but there are just a few contradictions which I don't understand, or incongruencies. Where you've mentioned previously, we've seen Russia speak against much of the insanity of the West. It's globalism, this whole transgenderism, insanity, and so forth. But there have been some instances where it seemed Russia did play ball with aspects of globalism, whether it was these playing along with this COVID technocracy regime and things like this. Do you have any thoughts on that? How to make sense of that?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin, of all the Russian leaders, is probably the one who has both a certain amount of affection for and understanding of the West. Remember, he lived for quite a while in Germany, and he's been able to travel. People condemn him routinely. Oh, he's a KGB thug monster and so forth. The truth is that during the Soviet years, the people that understood the most about the world beyond the borders of the Soviet Union were KGB agents, because they were the ones who could leave and move freely. And they did not come back ideologically hardened opponents of the West. In most cases, they came back and said, well, we've got to make changes here. We've got to adapt. And you know the story behind Gorbachev. All of that came to a head. It's not the first time in Russian history. The Russians went through this with the Decembrists after the Napoleonic Wars. The point is, I think Putin was always trying to find a good rapport with the West. He was trying to make Russia a strategic partner for the West in both economic as well as political terms, and for that matter, even militarily. I can tell you when I was on active duty in 2001, that the intelligence and material support the Russians provided to us in Afghanistan was invaluable. We could not have gone in and had any success dealing with terrorism in that country without the support and the assistance of the Russians. It's why so many of us were really surprised when we suddenly turned around and struck at the Russians, because the Russians were helpful. Look, when Donald Trump was president, whenever we went forward with these pointless missile strikes in places like Syria or Iraq, the Russians always accommodated us, not because they were afraid of us. They knew it was pointless. They knew it was stupid. They said, well, let's let the Americans do this, then we'll get back to normality. And that's effectively what happened when Trump was in office. But the problem is that today we've gone too far. We pushed the Russians too hard. We demanded that they effectively humiliate themselves in front of us. In other words, surrender any control or interest in the countries that border them. Submit to this NATO-style hegemony, which is financial, economic, political, and military. It's not just one; it's all of it. The Russians have said no. And I think this is going to go on for a while longer until the economic strength in the United States wanes. And let's face it, we're not in good shape. The underlying fundamentals are poor. If you've had Jim Rogers and others on, then you know what I'm talking about. I don't need to repeat any of that. The reason I go to Nassim Taleb is because this is the man that invented the black swan. And what he says, and I agree with him completely, when somebody says, well, all right, Nassim Taleb, tell us when this Armageddon is going to happen. He looks at it, he says, well, I can't predict that. He said, it's coming and it's near. It's not far. It's in front of you. Look for it. People don't like that. They want you to give them a time and a date. It reminds me of Secretary of the Treasury Mellon in 1929, in June of 29. Let's see, that's 4 months before the crash. He gave a speech because people were a little nervous about what they thought then were some strange happenings in the market. And he gave a speech, it's very famous, and he said, we live in an era of unbroken prosperity. I know because my great-grandfather lost $4 million in the crash. And at the time, he said, well, I listened to Secretary Mellon. This is my maternal great-grandfather. I thought he was an honest man. I never met my great-grandfather, but if I ever do in the next life, I'll immediately go to him and say, what on earth possessed you to believe that nonsense? But I think we're in the same position now. We have lots of people saying, oh, you don't understand modern economics. Everything will be fine until it isn't. And that's where we're headed. And it is, I think, as Nassim Taleb points out, near rather than far away. And again, when that happens, no one in the United States, no one will give a damn what happens beyond the borders of the United States. Because you and I both know, truthfully, does an American, the average American, care what happens in eastern Ukraine? I don't think so. If they could even find it on the map. If you asked an American right now about the Yucatan Peninsula and troubles down there, most of them would say, huh? What? What are you talking about? America is exactly what a Spanish general staff officer told me in 1998. And when I was the director of the Joint Operations Center at SHAPE headquarters, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, he said, Colonel Macgregor, the United States is not a nation. It's not a country. It's a planet. And everybody lives on that planet. And what happens elsewhere isn't of anybody, is really not interested to much of anybody. There's a lot of truth in that statement. But that gets us into trouble, as you know.
Yeah, and sort of to bring things back home, that reminded me, I think there was a Mexican president in the 70s. I think it was Echeverria, who it turns out recently was the fourth Mexican president that was a CIA agent, but he came out and said the Mexican peso was not going to devalue, and then the next day it devalues. And so we talked about the economic situation, but I heard you recently on Patrick Bet-David's Valuetainment podcast, which is fantastic, and that was a great interview. You talked about there may not be 2024 elections, and setting the economics aside, there's talk of a second civil war. I've had people like James Wesley Rawls of Survival Blog on, and today it was just reported that Trump posted that he received a target letter from the DOJ saying they're going to arrest and indict him for J6. And so, any further thoughts on the scenario at home? Because it seems like the globalists also want to try and Balkanize. That's what they do. They Balkanize the Balkans, Yugoslavia, Iraq, you name it. And so any other thoughts on the road ahead in the United States?
Well, my point in saying what I did was that I think there are lots of discontented people, and there are many unknowns associated with this election cycle. It's a very strange environment right now. Most Americans, and I'm saying what I think is true. Perhaps people can show me polls that argue a different way, but I think most American adults who vote have real questions about our election integrity. Now, this is not entirely new. We've had problems with election integrity for years, particularly in the largest cities. I mean, the joke in New York and Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, election day was always called Resurrection Day because the dead, sprang up from the cemeteries and voted. So we've always had this problem. The second part is that there has been tremendous resistance to any sort of uniform law that addressed election integrity, designed to boost public confidence in the value of elections. This goes all the way back to the founders. The founders initially wrote into the Constitution that the states would be responsible for conducting elections. And that's, for me, on the state level, that's fine. But when you go to the federal level, that's problematic. But at the time, the states had all the money. They were very powerful entities. The 13 colonies, each of them were effectively countries in their own right. By the way, that persisted and brought on the Civil War because those states really were independent of the federal rule in cultural and human terms. People in those days rarely moved more than, say, 20 miles from where they were born. I mean, I laugh all the time when people say, well, why did so-and-so fight for the North and so-and-so fight for the South? Well, with very few exceptions, people didn't travel. And if you happen to live in Virginia or you happen to live in Kentucky or you were in Pennsylvania, well, you were probably going to fight with the bunch that they decided to join. It's that simple. Well, today we have a similar problem with the way elections are run. And we have to overturn that because if we can't get control of election integrity, we cannot be certain that the people who are voting are citizens, legal residents of the particular area where they vote, then how can we take elections seriously at all? And on top of that, you have the problem that very few people want to expose their families and their homes to the attacks of people that will hate them for whatever it is that they say or do. So you end up with a political class that is not necessarily composed of, let us say, the people everyone would really like to run the United States. But I'm sure that's probably true in Mexico as well.
Yeah, and in many countries, I thought maybe we're seeing a lot of censorship. The mainstream, I think a lot of people are losing faith in the mainstream media. At the same time, they're getting rid of all dissidents. We saw what happened to Tucker Carlson. Can you give us any tip when it comes to analyzing information, processing, sourcing information? How to think about this daily struggle to figure out what's going on. Any thoughts there?
Well, you're dead right. We don't teach people to think and analyze. They simply react. And it's bad news. I mean, it's easy to demonize Russia after you've had 50 years of Cold War against the Soviet Union. It's easy to persuade people that the Russians, once again, are evil actors, as they were in the Soviet era. That's a problem. There's no question about it. And people don't like to dig to find things out. There is no easy solution. For the people that want to be informed, as well as I do, you can dig through the internet and you can find lots of different sources of information. But for the average person that's trying to put food on the table, feed their families, preserve their homes, and get through life, it's a difficult process. So that means that you have to have a government that is committed to the truth, even if the truth hurts. We had that in this country for a long time. We don't anymore. And that's our problem. And we are seeing the government and its agencies weaponized for use against anyone that questions what they're doing. It's a scary thing. I don't think it's going to work. I think we'll overturn it, but we're going to go through some difficult times in the future. But, I grew up in a world where people that were FBI agents were viewed as among America's very best, people that were absolutely trustworthy, to whom you could turn under any and all circumstances. For the first time in my life, I see people telling me all the time, if any of them show up at your door, don't say a word and get your attorney and don't let them in your house and so forth. It's very, very interesting change culturally for Americans. Not so much in Mexico and Latin America, where most people, most of the time, have good reason to fear the police. But here, that's a big change. I certainly never viewed the police in Philadelphia when I was growing up as a danger. Certainly never saw them as the enemy. Absolutely not. So these are things that we have to fix. They won't be fixed easily. It's like everything else. When discipline breaks down in a military organization, it's very difficult to restore it. When a retreat begins, things fall apart. So we're essentially looking at those kinds of circumstances in civil society.